Welcome to today's webinar on GDPR 7 years on, where we'll discuss what's changed in EU's data privacy laws, what could be coming, and what your business needs to know to navigate this landscape. I'm Naomi Grossman, Learning and Content Manager here at VinciWorks, and I've been following the approach to data protection with fascination that has evolved from a completely new notion to an important feature to a highly regulated concept that has achieved significance in its broad application across nearly all sectors. It's hard to think of an area of business that doesn't deal with data. It's also hard to believe that it's already been 7 years now since the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR as we all fondly call it, came into force. In that time, this legislation has managed to be transformed from a daunting piece of EU regulation into a global benchmark for data protection. But GDPR, as we all know, is not static. Over the past year, we've all watched its enforcement reach new levels, with over €1 billion in fines issued. And I said that correctly, over €1 billion in fines. And regulators, it seems, are not showing any signs of slowing down. So today, we'll discuss what's changing in GDPR and how that affects you. We'll, of course, explore the challenge of AI and how it's rewriting compliance and how this all ties into the UK's proposed Data Use and Access Bill. We'll explore how you can help your company stay compliant with a focus on training, and we'll look at how the global data wars will impact your business. As always, we'll discuss practical steps your business or law firm can take to stay ahead of all these regulatory changes, and we'll be taking your questions and comments throughout. So please, we really do want to hear from you. Ask us questions, comment, give us your comments. We want to hear. We really do want to hear from you during today's webinar. If you have any questions, comments, or experience of some of these issues, please do let us know in the chat or Q&A, and we will try and respond to some of those as we go through. If we don't get to your question over the next hour, we will get back to you by email, and you can either use the chat function or Q&A on Zoom. This session is being recorded, as I said, and you will get a recording automatically after the webinar. If you would like to see more of VinciWorks training options around GDPR, you can write GDPR into the webinar chat right now. If you are interested in learning more about automated GDPR registers, which can aid in GDPR compliance, write OmniTrack now in the chat. Someone will be in touch with you. So a little bit more housekeeping. We also have a series of upcoming webinars. If you are looking for more guidance and support on compliance, please do join by clicking on the links coming up in the chat right now, or forward these on to colleagues who might be interested. On Wednesday, June 18th at 12 p.m. UK time, we have a webinar on the latest in L&D, trends and transformations in workplace learning. On Wednesday, July 2nd, 12 p.m. UK time, the Wellbeing Footprint, Rethinking Mental Health First Aid at Work. On Wednesday, July 16th, same time, 12 p.m. UK time, how to avoid bribery prosecution. So really interesting webinars coming up. We've also recently published a fantastic new guide to buying compliance tech, and this is incredibly comprehensive. You're really going to want to get your hands on this. Make sure you get your free copy. It's coming up in the chat right now. You can easily download it. So now let's get started. I am delighted to be joined today by Nick Henderson-Mayo, VinciWorks regulatory and compliance expert.
Thanks, Naomi. Always great to be here, and especially now with so much activity around GDPR, we have an awful lot to unpack.
That is so true. And we're also joined today by Alyssa Redson, Chief Product Officer at VinciWorks. And Alyssa, I know you have a lot to say on this topic.
It's great to be here. And yes, I do have a lot to say. This has been one of the busiest years for data protection since GDPR first launched.
Oh, that is so true. Now, before we dive right into the new changes, let's hear from all of you with our first poll question. The question is, how confident are you in your data protection procedures? Are you very confident, somewhat confident, have some gaps to address, have serious issues to address, or you're just not sure? Again, poll question, how confident are you in your data protection procedures? Very confident, somewhat confident, have some gaps to address, have some serious issues to address, or not sure? Give everyone a couple more seconds. How confident are you in your data protection procedures? An extremely relevant question. Okay. Really interesting answers. How confident are you in your data protection procedures? 14% of you are very confident, which is a pretty nice number. 44% are somewhat confident. 33% feel you have some gaps to address. Only 3% feel you have serious issues to address, and 6% are not sure. Okay, those are really interesting results. One thing that's coming up in our chat is our guide to GDPR compliance. And this is, again, another comprehensive guide that can really help in staying compliant with GDPR. So let's get right into it. Data protection procedures are so relevant now, considering the changes that are being discussed now to GDPR. And that's why so many of you are here today. They are likely the most consequential developments in EU data protection since 2018, when GDPR was enacted, and the first time the European Commission is actually proposing formal changes to GDPR. Nick, can we dive right into these changes?
Absolutely, Naomi. It's such a big deal because GDPR was politically untouchable really for years. But now it's fallen under the Commission's broader simplification agenda, which is aimed at reducing or even slashing the regulatory burdens on European companies in order to help European companies better compete on a global stage. Essentially, we're seeing a really fundamental shift in tone from the EU Commission. And of course, privacy advocates and some industry groups are concerned about that.
Yeah, I'm so sure. So what's actually changing? What can we expect?
So these are all proposals at the moment from the Commission, but we do expect these proposals to kind of make their way into law. The biggest news is the expanded reporting exemptions. So under current GDPR rules, companies with under 250 employees don't have to maintain as detailed records of processing activities unless they engage in high risk processing. So that includes documenting what data they collect, who it's shared with, and the safeguards in place. But under the new proposals from the Commission, that threshold will be quite drastically raised, and the exemption would apply to companies with up to 750 employees, as long as they have less than 150 million euro turnover or 129 million euro in total assets. So this potentially extends some of the GDPR reporting relief to an additional 38,000 companies across the EU.
Wow. So that's a really big deal for small and medium-sized companies.
Definitely. And it's important to point out that the exemption doesn't apply if a company processes special category data, or if its processing is likely to result in a high risk to individuals' rights. So it would be a qualified change. And at least on paper, the framework could still be said to preserve core safeguards, but some elements will be changing.
Right. Okay. So that's significant in light of the pushback from industry groups that we had mentioned before. But the Commission's push to reduce red tape for small and mid-sized companies under GDPR, it's a big story, but it's not the whole story here, is it, Alyssa?
You're exactly right. So there's also a compliance shift that focuses on real-time transparency and faster enforcement. Businesses need to tell users at the point of data collection exactly what's happening with their personal data. And that means companies will need to update how their systems handle privacy notifications in real time. So a good example of this is if you introduce a new CRM or plug in a third-party analytics tool, your privacy policy has to reflect that immediately, not just sort of once a year in a vague update. And if you're shifting the purpose of processing, like if you decide to train an AI model on customer data, which is something that's really big in the sphere right now, that must be disclosed to the user clearly and upfront. Sort of these catch-all privacy notices, they're no longer acceptable, and regulators now expect dynamic, use-specific disclosures. So basically, every time your data use changes, whether you're onboarding a new vendor, launching a new service, or just tweaking your marketing model, your privacy documentation really needs to reflect that.
Okay, so that's really important to know.
Yes, especially if you're managing compliance across regions, but it's also an opportunity. When you're transparent about what you're doing with your data, your users trust you more, and regulators are more likely to take a supportive approach.
Thank you. That's very, very good point. And Alyssa also mentioned faster enforcement. So, Nick, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, enforcement is becoming more coordinated, faster, and more strategic over the last few years. And there are a few clear changes it's worth highlighting. And one of the biggest is faster cross-border cooperation in the EU itself. So EU investigations for a GDPR issue used to take a very long time. But they've made some procedural reforms and also have had pressure from the European Data Protection Board, which oversees all of GDPR, to make a more streamlined effort coordination. So what we're seeing as a result of that is some faster outcomes in some large cross-border cases, especially those we've seen in the news around big tech. So those fines have come faster than they used to. And regulators are also focusing a bit less on the kind of technical non-compliance aspects and much more on the risk to individuals, like discrimination from profiling, or if there's lack of consent when it comes to sensitive data, or also opaque data sharing if you're not being clear about where the data is being shared. So if any of those kinds of practices might lead to harm, you're much more likely to face action from a regulator, even if you didn't have an actual data breach. And it's also important to note that authorities are increasingly using corrective powers, not just their fining powers. So that might mean they're doing things like ordering a company to stop unlawful processing, potentially suspending their ability to do international data transfers, requiring changes to user interface or content or consent flows. Those obviously can be sometimes just as disruptive, if not more, to business operations than a fine. So there is a range of tools that regulators can use. And we're also seeing more proactive investigations from regulators. These are seen in some of the more high-risk sectors, like so if you're in ad tech, if you're in health, education platforms, also even remote work tools and AI-powered decision-making tools are all seeing more proactive investigations. So enforcement is not just a reactive thing that's happening.
Wow, so it's really interesting. And I think for a lot of businesses, the takeaway is that you don't have to be Meta or TikTok to face scrutiny. If you're using personal data in complex ways, especially in sensitive contexts or without clear transparency, you could really land on the regulator's radar.
That's exactly right. So the focus is now on accountability and practice. Are you documenting your decisions? Can you explain your data workflows? Are your lawful conditions for processing valid and up to date? These are the kinds of things that regulators are asking, often in spot audits or as a part of responding to a single subject access request. And like you said, Naomi, it's not just the Googles and Metas of the world feeling the heat anymore. We're seeing smaller businesses, especially those offering online services across EU borders, increasingly caught up in investigation. And that includes UK-based firms that work with EU customers or processors. And they all need to take notice. They need to know that, for instance, you can't take longer than 1 month to respond to a data subject request or access or deletion. Regulators are also taking a zero tolerance approach to vague responses or to missing audit trails.
Absolutely. And I think also very likely to see more audits from regulators and more upheld complaints. And in general, regulators have less patience for businesses that can't show clearly what data they have, where it's going, or how it's being used and secured. And businesses of all sizes need to be really careful about mishandling a deletion request or failing to produce a proper data trail.
Exactly, Nick. This means that UK companies with customers in the EU or using EU-based processors should review their compliance strategies. Global firms can't afford to think off of GDPR as a distant issue anymore. The pace is really picking up and the net is widening.
Wow, thank you both. This is really important to know. So what about the templates that I heard about? Will that help? Will that ease compliance, Nick?
Yeah, so understanding the EU Commission is working on plug and play templates, which would be ready to use DPIAs, privacy notices, even risk assessments that are more tailored to small and mid-sized companies. And this could mean you won't need expensive consultants to stay compliant. Also, we've got the standard contractual clauses, the SCCs. They've been updated into a more modular and streamlined format, which is supposed to make it easier for SMEs to use. There is clear guidance there for also assessing third country risk, and the templates are now easier for small and mid-sized businesses to adopt, which also means there's less of an excuse to not put that into place.
Right. That's a really important point. And so then the next obvious question is, what about fines? Will those change?
Fines could actually become more proportionate under the changes we might see. GDPR fines obviously have been quite serious until now. There's been something, a total of €5.5 billion in fines have been imposed by regulators, and it's an increase of €1.17 billion compared to last year. There's also been a proposal to actually increase fines for the most serious violations to 10% of global turnover from a company. That's up from 4%, or €100 million. And that would be for very large companies like Meta, for example. It was recently fined €1.2 billion and was the largest ever GDPR fine to date. TikTok was recently fined €345 million, and Amazon was fined $746 million. So that those numbers could become even higher.
I just wanted to jump in, but it's not only the big tech firms getting fined. There was also an interesting case of a small Polish e-commerce firm, and they were fined €20,000 last year for not encrypting personal data during transit. There was also a medium-sized German SaaS platform who was fined £50,000 for failing to action a deletion request. So those fines didn't really make the headlines, but they affect everyday businesses. That's the reality we're working in now, that could change. There's also talk of giving small businesses that slip up maybe once corrective action instead of jumping straight to punitive fines. And then meanwhile, the opposite would be the case for bigger companies. And that could make a big difference. Another difference could be the talk of lighter rules for appointing a data protection officer. So this would only apply if your business is not processing large scale sensitive data, but it should make compliance easier on a lot of businesses.
Yeah. Really interesting, and really interesting to see how this all plays out. And this is a perfect time for another poll question. And we want to hear from everyone here. Do you know where all your customer data is stored and who processes it on your behalf? So answers, yes, we are in full control of our data inventory and the processors. Mostly, but we have a few third parties we should review. Not really. Our records are outdated or incomplete. Not at all, or not sure. So the question is, do you know where all your customer data is stored and who processes it on your behalf? Yes, we are in full control of our data inventory and the processors. Mostly, but we have a few third parties we should review. Not really. Our records are outdated or incomplete. Not at all, or not sure. So give a couple more seconds to answer this question. Do you know where all your customer data is stored and who processes it on your behalf? Probably important information. Couple more seconds and we'll get some answers. Okay, really interesting. So 37% of you said you are in full control of your data inventory and the processors. 43% of you, nearly half, say mostly, but we have a few third parties we should review. Only 5% say not really, our records are outdated or incomplete. 1% say not at all, which I suppose is good. And 13% are not sure. So really interesting and more positive than I would have assumed. So that's good. And Nick, do you have some questions from the audience for us?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a number of great questions coming through. So I'll just take a minute to answer some of those that have come up. So a few people are asking when the EU changes will come into force. So these changes have just been proposed by the Commission, and actually they're actually in the process of proposing even more. They have to go through the EU's ordinary legislative procedure, meaning they have to go through the EU Parliament and then go through discussions with the Commission and the Council of Ministers. So we're likely to see maybe something around after the summer, end of the year. We'll probably get a stronger idea of exactly what's going to change. We do know the EU Commission, also several EU countries, particularly France and Germany, are very keen to make these changes happen. So I would have thought by the end of this year, we'll get a good idea about exactly what's changing and when. Also had quite a few questions about these templates we've discussed and when they'll be available. Short answer is we don't know exactly yet. The Commission has proposed them, they've suggested them. I imagine they'll probably come with the legislation that comes later in the year. So probably roughly around that later in the year. And we also had a question about sending data, I think, to Dubai, and then what are the risks and issues we face. If you're sending it to any third country that doesn't have an adequacy agreement, and that would include Dubai and further afield, you must do a risk assessment. And then you also have to have something like your standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules or something in place to protect the data if it goes abroad. So it's very, very important that if you're sending data to any country that is not the US or not an adequacy decision from the EU, that you do all the right paperwork. And there is quite a lot to make sure that it's kept safe and secure.
Really, really important. Thank you. And we have a data protection policy template that is really effective in ensuring that your policy is communicated throughout your organization, because that's one of the most significant issues here, is that everyone should know how to protect the data. It doesn't help if you say we have to protect our data. Everyone needs to know, and having a policy that's communicated throughout the organization is incredibly helpful. So a link is coming up to it now in the chat. It's our data protection policy template, and be really, really helpful. Also, if you're interested in learning more about automated GDPR registers, which can really help in GDPR compliance, I see that there are a few questions in the chat about starting with GDPR compliance. This can really be helpful. So write OmniTrack now in the chat, and someone will be in touch to let you know about OmniTrack, to introduce you to it, to give you a demonstration. Write OmniTrack in the chat now, and someone will be in touch with you about that. So GDPR has also changed quite a lot recently, despite the EU's proposals to change it now, which is known now as the Omnibus. And Alyssa, let's talk about that. What's changed already?
That's a really good point, Naomi. So we tend to focus on what's coming next, but GDPR has already started to evolve, and a major catalyst is the EU AI Act. And even though it was only formally adopted in May 2024, and it won't fully be applicable until mid-2026, it's already shifting how data protection authorities, especially in countries like Ireland, France, and Germany, are prioritizing enforcement.
Wow. But I guess that does make sense.
Yeah. In fact, one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing now is stricter enforcement around AI use under GDPR. So regulators are focusing on how personal data is being used to train, deploy, and monitor AI systems. So things like automated hiring, credit scoring, content moderation, even AI that shapes the news and what you see and how prices are calculated online. GDPR covers automated decision-making. And what we're seeing is that data protection authorities are becoming much tougher. This means if you're using AI systems and your AI system is making even slightly influencing decisions about individuals, you're now expected to either get explicit consent or embed meaningful human oversight. And that's not optional anymore. Enforcement actions in the last year have made that very clear.
Wow. Thank you for that important information. And Nick, it sounds like the bar for transparency is just getting higher. Is that right?
Harder and higher. It absolutely is. And the business needs to really explain in plain language. So if you're using any AI, you really, really have to be very clear. What is the AI doing with people's data? How is it making those decisions? Why? What's the safeguards? Although there was a story in the news just yesterday that potentially the EU Commission is weighing up a delay maybe in the implementation of the AI Act, possibly putting the AI Act through its own omnibus, aka simplification process. All of that is up in the air, but the EU has been having somewhat of a bonfire of regulations recently. It's torched sustainability. Now it's coming for GDPR, and it might even consider delaying or slimming down the AI Act. Nevertheless, though, AI regulation is still happening, and also in lots of different countries as well. The US and different states are discussing their own AI regulations. The UK is probably going to move forward with AI legislation later in this year. The main thing that AI regulations target is companies who are using things like AI for recruitment, credit scoring, or personalized marketing. And so despite this potential for more change, there is still a compliance angle for anyone who processes or targets EU residents. And in general, regulators are looking at how you train AI models, what data you're using, and whether you have a lawful basis for that under GDPR, and how you're interpreting that through the AI Act. So there is quite a lot of stuff to do if you're using AI.
Wow. Yeah. And a lot to be kept aware of with the AI Act. That's really important. And that really expands the scope, doesn't it, Alyssa?
It does. So the AI Act is effectively tightening GDPR. So, for example, where GDPR left more wiggle room around profiling or automated decisions, the AI Act forces stricter requirements like conducting fundamental rights impact assessments and ensuring traceability in high-risk systems. So these expectations are being pulled into GDPR enforcement early ahead of the AI Act's formal application dates. If needed, it does come in as and when expected, as Nick alluded to earlier. And this is already showing up in audits and investigations. So authorities are asking for algorithmic documentation, human review procedures, and evidence of risk mitigation, even in normal, regular GDPR cases.
Wow. So the AI Act is effectively reshaping how GDPR is applied.
Yes, and businesses should see them as combined compliance environments. So it's no longer enough to just tick GDPR boxes, especially if you're using AI in any decision-making capacity. So this means if you haven't revised your DPIAs or your data governance model doesn't account for AI-specific risks and you're using AI, now is the time. Regulators aren't waiting for 2026. The enforcement shift is already here.
Wow. Okay. Good to know. Now let's get to another poll question. And the question is your organization currently using AI or machine learning tools that process personal data? And the answers are yes, we use it extensively across departments. Yes, in limited or experimental ways. No, but we plan to soon. No, and no plan to. Not sure. So the question is your organization currently using AI or machine learning tools that process personal data? And the answer is, again, yes, we use it extensively across departments. Yes, in limited or experimental ways. No, but we plan to soon. No, and no plans to. It'll be interesting to see who chooses that. Not sure. Again, give a couple more seconds. Is your organization currently using AI and machine learning tools that process personal data? Really like to hear from everybody here. Interesting question. Okay, really interesting. Only 3% of you said yes, we use it extensively across departments. 23% of you said yes, in limited or experimental ways. 20% of you say no, but we plan to soon. 37% of you say no and no plans to. And 16% are not sure. So that's interesting results. How many of you do not plan to use any of the AI tools? And Nick, I think you have some more questions from the audience for us.
Yeah, definitely. There's some really good questions coming in. One that came in was very, very interesting, actually. How far does the responsibility for due diligence and compliance obligations go if you're sending your data to someone and they subcontract a processor based outside of the UK or EEA? The short answer is the responsibility stays with you. If you're the data controller, it doesn't matter how many levels you send it to sub-processors and where they send it, you remain fully responsible for that. So if you are sending data and if that is being sub-processed in other places, you really have to make sure that you're doing very good due diligence on the sub-processors that you're sending that to, and potentially even put limits on what they can and can't do, or you can even look at the risk assessments, and you really have to think about the mitigation measures, and because that responsibility remains with you. And another question was, is this only EU GDPR that's changing? What's happening about the UK? So the EU's commission proposals are only affecting EU GDPR, but the UK is simultaneously changing its own version of GDPR through the Data Use and Access Bill, and then we're about to get onto that, so we'll get into those details as well. So the two things are separate, but they are happening in tandem.
Yeah. And just so everyone here knows, we have a very comprehensive guide to the EU AI Act coming up in the chat now. And this is really everything you want to know about the EU AI Act. So really, really good guide to read now, especially in light of the possible potential changes that could be happening. And we also have a number of courses on using AI in the workplace and AI in data protection training, right? AI into the chat now if you want to see more of those. And it's interesting. I saw someone commented and said, sometimes you don't even realize you're using AI in the workplace. Some of your tools are actually using AI. So some of you who might have said you don't use AI and don't plan to might not even be aware that some of the tools you use do have some AI functions. So it's just it's an important point to know. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. And like Nick said, we're going to talk about the UK's proposed data use and access bill. So Nick, let's talk about it. How does it compare to GDPR?
So as I just mentioned, this is happening in tandem to the EU's GDPR changes. And what happened after Brexit, GDPR was essentially copied and pasted into UK law. And in the UK, it's called UK GDPR. And in the EU, it's called EU GDPR. And they're essentially the same thing, but both are changing. And the UK government is positioning this data use and access bill as a much more pro-innovation and business-friendly version of GDPR. For one thing, the bill is going to propose scrapping the requirement to appoint a data protection officer, and instead will let most businesses assign data responsibilities in a much more flexible way. It's also going to replace mandatory data protection impact assessments with a more risk-based assessment process. So organizations will have a lot more discretion about how they manage data risks.
Oh, and what about data reuse and AI?
Yeah, and there's also a big push to open things up there. The bill broadens permissions for reusing personal data that you as a company hold. So, for instance, you could, having a lot of customer data and potentially reuse that for research, for even developing AI under certain conditions. The idea is to allow a lot more innovation while still keeping the basic safeguards in place. So in theory, it's going to give UK-based companies much more flexibility than the current GDPR allows. That's pre the commission's changes when it comes to repurposing data. But then we are, seeing the EU changing its own version of GDPR. So, in a year's time, when it comes to do the 8th anniversary, both the UK and the EU GDPRs are probably going to look very different.
Wow. And we'll be right here to tell you all about it. And so it sounds like they're trying to reduce red tape. So, Alyssa, is this a win for UK businesses?
In some ways, absolutely yes. So if you're operating only in the UK, the bill could simplify your compliance responsibilities and make it a bit cheaper to manage data governance. But there is a question of EU adequacy. So right now, the UK and the EU have an adequacy decision, which allows for smooth data transfers from one location to the other. But if these reforms go too far, then there is a risk that the EU commissioner could decide that the UK no longer meets the standards of data protection required under the current version of EU GDPR. And if that happens, businesses will need to implement another process like standard contractual clauses, just like with the US or any other third country. So both the UK and the EU are looking at simplifying data protection rules that we've passed 7 years ago. But what's interesting to see and to keep watching is that if the EU goes too far, the UK might decide that the EU is no longer adequate. So nevertheless, there are massive changes in data protection going on across either side of the English Channel, and a lot more change for companies to understand and ultimately to ensure that they get right.
Wow. Yeah, there really is a lot of changes ahead, potential changes ahead. So, Nick, where are we in the legislative process for the data use and access bill? Like, when is that coming into force?
Yeah, we're a wee bit stuck actually, because the House of Commons and the House of Lords keep rejecting each other's amendments to the data use and access bill. The Lords keep inserting amendments around AI and training AI models with big tech. So there's a kind of a fight in the media as well. People like Elton John and stuff are on the side of protecting content from AI, whereas the House of Commons keeps voting to overturn those amendments. Essentially what that means is that it's kind of stuck. It's not really kind of going anywhere because the Lords keep supporting their own amendments and the Commons keep supporting their own amendments, which means we're in what's called parliamentary ping pong, and it really just depends who's gonna give in. The government obviously really wants to get this legislation over the line, and is clearly really committed to getting it through. just the Lords has to kind of either give in or they have to reach some sort of agreement. But because of this delay, it's very, very unlikely that it's going to receive royal assent before the summer. So even if they come to some sort of agreement on these AI issues, I think it would be after the summer that would even get royal assent. And then we would start to see kind of the schedule of when different parts will come into force.
Wow. Okay. So what's the bottom line now for UK companies?
So even if the UK's version of data protection becomes more flexible, any business that interacts with EU data still has to meet the EU's current GDPR standards. So you will still need systems that can handle both, because one framework doesn't replace the other.
And don't wait for final passage of the UK bill. Start mapping out your data flows across the EU and the UK borders and how your legal bases and risk assessments will need to adapt now.
Right. Now, that's great advice. Thank you, Alyssa. And with all these changes, both actual and proposed, what should businesses be doing right now to stay compliant and to future-proof their data practices?
I think really the main piece of advice is don't be passive. Whether you're a UK only business, whether you're operating across borders, whether you're operating internationally, you really want to make sure you're staying on top of it. And also audit where's your data going, especially if you're using things like AI, if you're using overseas vendors. Get a handle on where everything is, where it's going, how it's being processed, because then if and when changes come through, you'll be more better equipped to kind of manage and deal with those compliance changes if you get a very good picture of where everything is. Then the next most important thing is to keep the privacy notices up to date so they actually reflect the real ways that you're using data. They shouldn't be generic, they shouldn't be boilerplate, they should be very, very clear and specific and updated as frequently as needed. Also make sure you've got a lawful basis for processing data whenever it's being processed, however it's being processed, especially if you're relying on things like consent or legitimate interest, which can often be misunderstood or misapplied. So it's really, really important just to have a very strong compliance handle on all of this. And also, this is really significant, and I know Alyssa will agree, but train your teams regularly and frequently and as often as you can. GDPR is not a one and done exercise. It's all about promoting good data habits across your organization, and you get there through good and frequent training.
Thank you. That's really, really practical advice, Nick. Thank you. And Alyssa, you want to add anything to that list?
Yeah, I would just add, be ready for more DSARs or data subject access requests. They've been on the rise, they are on the rise, and make sure you've got a process in place to respond quickly and thoroughly to those when they come up. Also, and I can't emphasize this enough, stay informed so you can subscribe to updates from your regulator and your industry bodies. The guidance changes and staying ahead is half the battle. And this is for UK businesses especially, but keep a close eye on the EU adequacy discussions we mentioned earlier. If that status changes, the impact on international data transfers could be significant. And I'm going to emphasize Nick's point on training your teams. It can't be said enough.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And those are really clear, actionable steps. And to everyone listening, whether it's tightening your privacy notices or keeping tabs on the UK's regulatory direction, now is the time to get proactive. That message is heard loud and clear. And this is a perfect segue to discuss how to train employees on GDPR. But before we do, let's do a quick poll question. Do you think your current GDPR training program is effective in ensuring your employees can maintain GDPR compliance? Yes, and we are ready for the upcoming changes. Yes, but we are concerned about the upcoming changes. No, we are just not being trained effectively. We don't have a training program and not sure. So again, the question, do you think your current GDPR training program is effective in ensuring your employees can maintain GDPR compliance? Yes, and we are ready for the upcoming changes. Yes, but we are concerned about the upcoming changes. No, we are not being trained effectively. We don't have a training program or not sure. So give a couple more seconds for the answer. Do you think your current GDPR training program is effective in ensuring your employees can maintain GDPR compliance? And I know, Alyssa, you're especially interested in these answers. 14% of you say yes, and we are ready for the upcoming changes. Now, a whopping nearly half of you, 45%, say yes, but we are concerned about the upcoming changes. 16% of you say you are not being trained effectively. 12% don't have a training program, and 13% are not sure. So these are important numbers, interesting results. And just remember, you can write GDPR to see more about our courses. So Alyssa, we've heard about the upcoming changes to GDPR. We know how important this regulation is, and we are aware that training employees on GDPR is important. As I said, this is the perfect segue to talk about VinciWorks' courses on GDPR and data protection.
Absolutely. And following that poll, for those who are concerned about the upcoming changes, a little bit about what we're doing. So it is significant regulation, and training is important to effectively manage compliance. And I want to emphasize first that at VinciWorks, we do keep our training materials aligned with the regulatory landscape, and even as that's often changing. So our research, writing, and course team are actively monitoring the GDPR space. And the moment we receive formal guidance or see meaningful changes in the law, we update the courses. These changes are always transparent. So every course in our content portal includes an audit history with a log showing you exactly what's been updated, when it was updated, and what we changed. Whether that's a minor clarification or a major compliance shift, you can track all of that in detail. And we're also really ready to be flexible. If a significant change comes into force, for example, from a new piece of legislation or key regulatory decisions come into force, we can and will deploy short, focused one-off training modules so that you can help your staff get up to speed with any changes really quickly. The training courses in our library are engaging for learners. We have a lot of interactive touch points for key risk areas, and we want to ensure that our courses meaningfully impart the concepts that you need to train your staff on. Our commitment is to ensure that your teams always have access to accurate, timely, and actionable training, no matter how fast the rules are changing.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you, Alyssa. Really, really, really important for everyone here to know about. And let's see a little bit more about our GDPR collection. Now we're going to show a video that highlights what we do here with our GDPR training. So we're going to go into that video right now in a couple of minutes.
Data protection isn't just important, it's essential. But as laws and risks evolve, keeping your people informed isn't just a checkbox, it's a strategic priority. Our suite of training courses gives your teams the clarity, confidence, and skills to stay ahead.
There's kind of three key strategies. So you've got your people, your process, and then technology. So if you start with your people, the first thing that you're always going to need to do is make sure that you've got appropriate training, education, and awareness within your business.
Learn directly from leading voices in the field and hear how experts are advising on these concepts.
People care about their data more than ever, and if an organisation is not handling it safely and correctly and in line with legislation and standards, their reputation nowadays will simply plummet. Unfortunately, companies that have not taken it seriously have gone under as a direct result.
See how key concepts come to life with drama scenarios that bring data protection challenges into focus.
Username, Darren. Password, 123456.
123456. That's your password.
What? I use that for most of the sites that I use. Keep it simple. All of this number, letter, capital letter, nah. Way too much stuff to keep on.
From quick knowledge checks to in-depth courses tailored to different roles, our content library offers multiple learning approaches to suit every learner. Empower your team with training that sticks and scales. Check out our data protection library now and raise the bar on your training.
So that was our existing collection of courses, and we are always looking at new ways to bring you better and more engaging training. And that's why we're about to launch our brand new AI-powered conversational learning course. Now, the conversational learning experience affords even better engagement, higher knowledge retention, and much richer learning, all supported with AI trained by our compliance experts. The learners actively engage with the course material in natural conversation. It's truly an experience that is new in the world of online training. So if you want to learn more about our conversational learning courses, write CL in the chat right now and someone will be in touch with you. And we have another poll question here that is relevant to our courses. And the question is, are you open to using AI to improve your data protection training? Yes, we're already using AI tools to improve our training. Possibly we're interested to learn more. Not yet, but we're weighing it up. No, it's not a priority for us right now, or not sure. And again, the question, are you open to using AI to improve your data protection training? Yes, we're already using AI tools to improve our training. Possibly we're interested to learn more. Not yet, but we're weighing it up. No, it's not a priority for us right now, and not sure. A couple more seconds to answer our question. Are you open to using AI to improve your data protection training? Really curious to hear what everyone has to say. So really interesting. 6% of you say, yes, you're already using AI tools to improve your training. 33% say possibly we're interested to learn more. 20% say not yet, but we're weighing it up. 28% say no, it's not a priority for us right now. And 14% are not sure. So again, that's interesting. Nearly a third of you are interested in it. So let's now turn to data protection around the world, specifically to its impact on the trade tensions between the US, UK, and EU. In particular, the friction between the US and the EU over data privacy and GDPR. Like, could US cloud services like Zoom and Teams be banned in the EU? What would happen if, once again, the EU-US data sharing agreement is scrapped?
So we've actually already been down this road before when the EU-US Privacy Shield was struck down by an EU court several years ago, and in its place, the US and the EU agreed to this transatlantic data privacy framework, which is what we have now, and that has oversight from a US body called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. Now, the reason it's been complicated to share data with the US is because the EU has these restrictions on sending any data outside of the EU to a country without essentially equivalent privacy safeguards. And the issue is that in the US, they allow for very broad government access to data stored by companies like Amazon, Meta, and Google, and that conflicts directly with EU's privacy laws with GDPR. Now, in this a data sharing agreement with the US was working well, but in January of this year, President Trump dismissed 3 Democratic members of this oversight board, and that raised some concerns that the US may be rolling back some of its privacy commitments. And since that oversight board was really key in aligning US practices with EU standards, the restructuring of such a thing, or even the restructuring of the agreement itself, could lead the EU to do a reassessment about whether the US still offers an adequate data protection safeguard. Now, if the EU was to decide the US doesn't meet its standards, we might see this current agreement maybe suspended. And we know some privacy advocates are already pushing for yet another court case to challenge the legality of all of that. And that would really leave any businesses dealing with international data transfers between the US, the EU, and around the world scrambling for some kind of alternative.
Wow. Thank you, Nick. It's important. And Alyssa, what would happen if the agreement is suspended? Like, what are the implications for businesses?
So right now it's a theoretical question, but if that happened, it would be a massive disruption. So under GDPR, data transfers outside the EU must be protected by an equivalent privacy standard, like Nick was mentioning. But because US surveillance laws allow access to data stored by US-based companies, regardless of where the data is physically located, EU regulators may determine that US businesses can't ensure GDPR compliance. That could mean fines, legal uncertainty, and even potential bans on tools that we've come to rely on, like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, AWS. Platforms like these that handle sensitive corporate communications may be defined as a risk by the EU under GDPR. If this agreement is suspended, there might be restrictions placed on cloud storage systems like AWS. There's a lot of questions.
Wow. And Nick, does this mean we're headed for a full-blown data war?
I mean, there's definitely tensions have been escalating in recent months. And just the start of this year, President Trump signed an executive order calling for a review of GDPR's impact on US businesses. They've called EU fines unfair penalties. They've even called it overseas extortion. And the US tech giants are also frustrated with, just before the inauguration of Trump in January, Mark Zuckerberg had called on him to push back against EU regulations specifically. And over the last 2 decades, US companies like Meta and Amazon and Apple and Google, they've been fined more than $30 billion, about 30 billion, $30 billion under a variety of EU rules. And just last year, Meta faced a record €797 million antitrust fine.
Wow, it's a lot of money. Alyssa, how would this affect the UK?
So, and this is important to note, the UK has its own data bridge agreement with the US, allowing businesses to transfer data more easily. So it's not exactly the same thing as the situation with the EU. However, if the EU decides that the US is no longer providing adequate protections, the UK would come under pressure to reassess its own stance. And that's where things get even messier. So a divergence between EU and UK data policies could then threaten the UK's own adequacy decisions from the EU. And as we discussed before, that's already under some strain due to the UK's changes to GDPR and the proposed data use and access bill. So what I'm saying is, if there is a US-EU data war, the UK might not be able to maintain a neutral position. They're probably going to have to take a side.
Yeah, and I think the impact of big tech is actually really significant here, because for companies like Meta and Google, they're weighing up the cost of billions of fines from EU regulators over the short to medium term cost of a disruption to their EU services. If you remember, a few years ago, Meta launched their new social media app called Threads, and it wasn't available in the EU for quite a while. We also nearly saw TikTok banned recently. So I think this company is actually getting used to the idea that not every website or every kind of platform will be available in every country if it's just too expensive.
And like with tariffs, it's the uncertainty which will have the biggest impact. So lots of companies, especially small businesses who advertise on Facebook because it offers hyper local and hyper focused targeting. But if Facebook runs the risk of going offline in some countries, even if it's just for a short time, this would have a significant impact on your advertising revenue. And also, when GDPR was introduced, a lot of companies switched from email marketing to social media platforms to get around some of those consent rules. What would happen if your primary method of customer outreach suddenly went offline?
Wow. Okay, this is a really sobering thought, and there's a lot to think about and keep updated on. So thank you both. And we actually have a guide to the big issues in GDPR and AI this year. A link to that is coming up in the chat now. What to expect from AI and GDPR in 2025. A really good guide, a really important guide that could be very helpful right now. Okay, now I think we have time for a few questions that have come in. And first one is for you, Alyssa. And the question is, and I think it's relevant to a lot of people here, if we don't use AI now, if we're not using AI tools, do we still need to worry?
It's an excellent question. I think you brought this up, and one of the panelists put in our chat. It is something you need to be concerned about, because AI is creeping into a lot of third-party tools and CRMs, analytical tools, HR tools. If those tools are processing data on your behalf, you're still responsible for ensuring GDPR compliance, and you might not always know that AI is being used. So absolutely something to be concerned about and to be thinking about.
Exactly. Thank you. It's a good point. Now, Nick, this is a really good question for you. Will the data use and access bill be delayed if EU GDPR is being reviewed, or will it get amended if it does not align at a later point? Really good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question, but I think they are going on different tracks now. We are really in the era of de-alignment or unalignment between the EU and the UK in terms of data protection and a number of other areas. So I think it's more coincidence that these things are happening in tandem, as opposed to kind of any sort of strategic view to keep things aligned. So I don't think we will see alignment, and I think we'll just have to kind of live in this world of unalignment.
Well, thank you. It's a good question, a really good answer. And Nick, just a follow-up question. Why are these changes to GDPR happening now?
Also a really good question. And for years, there was really limited appetite to reopen GDPR, but really everything shifted with the European elections in June 2024. And that really kind of decimated a lot of the kind of pro-regulation voices in the EU Parliament. They really gutted a lot of the sustainability rules, acronyms like CSRD and CSDDD that we've heard about for a while are essentially delayed or gone. Now they're doing the same thing to GDPR as well. We're really, it's just use a political entity, and it's governed by, elected representatives and national governments, and the kind of prevailing shift at the moment is away from regulation after several decades, if not more, of kind of pro-regulation, and that's why we're seeing this shift at the moment.
Thank you. Really interesting. And Alyssa, another question that came in, that's a really good one. What are those most common mistakes in GDPR compliance made within financial services?
Awesome. Okay. So in financial services, many firms rely too much on getting consent to use personal data, even when that's not the best basis or the best option for them. So often it's more appropriate to use legal reasons like needing the data to provide a service or for a legitimate business purpose, which are more reliable and easier to manage. So many firms collect and keep more personal data than they need, and that increases the risk exponentially. So they don't often properly check or manage third-party partners who handle their data, and mistakes and delays in responding to requests from individuals like asking to see their data or delete their data, that can also lead to complaints and fines. That's not limited just to financial services. That last one's a big risk in general. A lack of clear roles and poor record keeping is also weakens your compliance strategy. These issues not only break GDPR rules, but they can also harm the trust and the reputation that you build up with your clients.
Right. That's a really good point. And it's not emphasized enough that there's also, besides the laws, there's trust and reputation that you build with your customers and clients. So Alyssa, let me throw one last question at you, and it's a good one. How can a company ensure GDPR compliance with employees working from abroad?
Excellent question. So to stay compliant, to stay GDPR compliant with employees working from abroad, companies should make sure that personal data is still handled securely, even across borders. And this means using secure systems. It means limiting access to data and checking if the data is being transferred outside the UK or the EU. If it is being transferred, proper safeguards are in place, like SCCs, which we mentioned earlier. Those have to be in place. For leavers, companies should be able to delete or anonymize personal data when it's no longer needed, unless there's a legal reason to keep it. And always clear policies, regular training, careful access controls to help sure that everything is compliant and above board.
Perfect note to end on. Clear policies, regular training, careful access controls. I love it. That's kind of the theme of the webinar. And like I said, a great note to end on. Thank you again to our panelists, Nick Henderson Mayo and Alyssa Retson. You guys were really, really extremely knowledgeable and helpful and made this a great webinar. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.